August 1st, 1993, my girlfriend and I were looking at basically a lot of history books because I was really fascinated with the reality of the house I lived in was the winter camp of Chief Casino. And I had put this together and realized that the Chinook chief once had his winter camp right under my house. So I was all fascinated with the Chinook living there once upon a time. And I started looking into what life was like for them. I didn't really know anything at that point. So I read a story by Paul Kane, an artist who wrote a book called Wanderings of an Artist Among North American Indians, and it was published about 1890. And in this book, he describes coming through this area where I lived in 1847. And he met some Indians, and he was talking to the Indians because where I lived in Linton, Oregon, you could see Mount St. Helens very clearly. And Paul Kane asked the Indians to guide him to Mount St. Helens. And they said, no, they wouldn't do it because skookums lived there. And he said, what are skookums? And he said, big hairy giants that are cannibals, cannibal giants, and eat people. And they live at Spirit Lake on Mount St. Helens. And they would not guide him there no matter what, because he was a painter and he just wanted to paint it. But they wouldn't do it. So I thought that was really fascinating. I said, wow, guy couldn't get, Indians wouldn't take him to Mount St. Helens because of the skookums. So I looked in Oregon geographic names and I found a reference to Skookum Lake in Clackamas County. And I said, Skookum Lake. And in the onomastic history of that name, onomastic meaning what the name of a place means, the story was that the Indians said the evil god of the woods lives at Skookum Lake. So I, being a brash idiot, said, hey, girlfriend, let's go camping at Skookum Lake right now. And we got up there Friday night at about midnight because it took us all day to sort everything out. And we get up there at midnight, and as we're driving the last quarter mile to the lake, suddenly this terrible smell appears. Skunk, wet dog smell, the kind of thing you hear from a lot of Bigfoot people, I think. And it was really pungent, and I stopped the van in the middle of the road, and we couldn't see a damn thing. It's just inky blackness. But suddenly all the hair on my head, and I have pretty long hair, and I had it long hair then, stood completely out from my head as if I had been rubbing balloons on top of it and then holding them over my head. And my hair stood out like Einstein. It was like, and all on my arms, all the hair was tingling and poking, like there was an electrostatic field that had surrounded me. And I could not deny the fact that it was an electrical field and I could feel it, and my hair was certainly showing it. My girlfriend suddenly just said, I'm really tired, I'm going to go to sleep. And she just passed right out in 30 seconds. And I said, well, that's weird. Both of these things are super weird. So I turned the van off and I just sat there. I never heard a thing. The crickets had stopped. Everything had stopped. It was so dead silent that nothing made a sound. And then the smell went away and the crickets started again. And I said, wow, what was that? And I thought to myself, I wonder if that's what people call Bigfoot. because it was so weird. And I had the smell of a wet dog at the beginning of it. And I said, wow, it smelled like a big hairy monster. It had that smell. And then there was this electrostatic field, and then wife passed out. And then The punchline is that the starter motor in my van had been blown out by that electrostatic field, and I was marooned there for 24 hours, and I had to hike out the next day to get a starter motor, to then get a friend driving me back, and I had to replace the starter motor. The starter motor in my van got blown out by it, so I had a clue that what had happened was real. My girlfriend and I agreed that on what we saw, which was nothing, but what we experienced was really strange. And so from the very first moment, I thought Sasquatch was capable of projecting a force field, because that's what happened to me on the very first minute of the first day that I, quote unquote, went looking for Sasquatch. But like I said, I wasn't really looking for Sasquatch. I was looking for the evil god of the woods that was said to live there. And then when I had this experience with the smell and the electrical field, well, a month later I came back. September 1st, 1993, I was camped with my girlfriend on top of a ridge called Camelback, which is on the other side of a box canyon from Skookum Lake. So I had gone back to almost the same spot, but I had gone about 2 miles west to this high ridge where I could see the whole area below me, around me. I was convinced I had a Bigfoot experience, but as you can tell, it was really sketchy. It was just a smell and a field, a force field and a smell. I met Ray Crow and Peter Byrne within the next couple days. I remembered seeing a bookstore in St. John's with a Bigfoot in the window. And of course, now I went into that bookstore and met Ray Crow and said, wow, Bigfoot. I sort of got sucked into the whole Bigfoot community at that time. Ray ran an organization called the Western Bigfoot Society, and Peter Byrne ran an organization called the Bigfoot Research Project. And Peter Byrne had obtained about $5 million in funding privately and was set up in the Hood River, Oregon. And I became part of his project and became a member of the board of advisors. And basically we would decide who got money for what. And we would finance different research and finance different scientists and different things. And that's how we spent the next 5 years, basically, was really trying to do what a lot of people try to do. We set up a 1-800-Bigfoot number, and we fielded it. We manned it with a person who had to take endless crank phone calls. Actually, about 100 to 1 was how crank versus real calls were. So that was a tough job. We had all kinds of equipment. We had a FLIR-mounted helicopter available to us, so if we had a sighting, we could send a forward-looking infrared helicopter, which we had leased from Columbia Helicopters. We had snowmobiles. We had all kinds of gear. We had a lot of gear, right? Important for Bigfoot research. And we had a lot of money. And we paid for a group of scientists headed by Jeff Glickman to analyze the Patterson film and prove that it was a guy in a gorilla suit. We took the opposite approach of trying to prove that it was a hoax. And we couldn't do it. But we hired a bunch of real forensic scientists, led by Glickman, as I said, to study the Patterson film. So we dropped about $500,000 analyzing the Patterson film and publishing the Nazi report in 1998, where we published our analysis. Now, of course, that was like not noticed by anybody. And I think maybe more people know about it today than ever, which means maybe 10 people have read it now. The thing is that it just was interesting because we really tried to use pure science and approach it with hard science. And the Bigfoot community did not appreciate that at all and thought that that was a complete waste of time. The goal of what we were doing was to try to get scientists and policymakers to take the Bigfoot phenomenon seriously. That was our goal of the Bigfoot Research Project. We did not succeed. Scientists and policymakers did not take the Bigfoot phenomenon seriously. They still don't. And I don't know if they ever will, but at that time, that's what we tried to do. So what I'm saying in short is scientists rejected us, academia rejected us, the Bigfoot community rejected us. Everyone pretended like nothing happened, and they all just did it again. And so it was like no analysis of the Patterson film was ever performed by anybody, and everybody that's come along since has done it for the first time. So it's interesting to see how history works and how, we're all forgotten very quickly. The obvious stuff to me was that there's an occipital protuberance on the back of the skull, which is a hominid variation. So it's not a primate, it's a hominid. It's of the hominid line because it has a large gluteus maximus, meaning a big butt. We humans have a big butt. Apes don't have a big butt. We do. And it has a point on the back of the skull where all the back muscles attach, the occipital protuberance, which means it was designed for walking erect. Also, a hominid line variation. For some reason, that doesn't ever get mentioned by anybody. I don't know. It's just like, it's as clear as day to me whenever I see the Patterson film now. I'm like, how can you miss that? And we had obtained from Patty Patterson, Roger's wife, the second copy ever made of the film. And we digitized that copy to get the best possible copy we could. And we actually gave Patty Patterson $20,000 to give us permission to digitize it. At that time, which was 1993, 94, we had it digitized in New Jersey at a film restoration lab used by Turner Classic Movies. So we spent quite a bit of money and things. And another thing that always struck me about the Patterson film, which we had a great copy, we could see the muscles moving under the fur with the resolution we had. We also could see the bottom of the feet, and we could see grains of sand stuck on the bottom of the feet. And we said, wow, that's really interesting too. And so everything that we did find in the film suggested it was actual observations of an uncatalogued animal and not a guy in a gorilla suit. We measured the height at 7 feet 3.5 inches, plus or minus 1 inch, which of course everyone disagrees about the height of Patty in the Patterson film. But we felt really strong, and still do to this day, that our estimate was the best. The other thing that I really notice about the Patterson film, which strikes me, is that Patty walks, does not run away. She walks away, and she avoids eye contact. One of the things I learned is that in the world of Bigfoot, one of the tickets you have to punch in order to be part of the community is you have to develop a position on the Patterson film, whether it's a hoax or not, or that sort of divides you into camps. Whatever your position is on the Patterson film pushes you this way or that way into like-minded individuals. I came away after spending $500,000 and getting a bunch of scientists to try to prove it was false, thinking it was real, and we were filming a real animal. But like I said, or as I was saying, The really key thing for me was that Patty walks and doesn't run away from the people, and avoids eye contact, which is what you or I would do if we encountered a wild animal. We would do the same thing. We would avoid running away because that's going to trigger the attack thing, like cougars killing bicyclists. And we would avoid eye contact with the predator, with the scary animal. So that struck me as a profound interpretation of the Patterson film. But it's been reinforced by, I don't know, 4,000 sighting reports where Patty does the same thing, or any Bigfoot does the same thing. They walk, they don't run away from the people, they avoid eye contact. There's certainly exceptions to that, but generally, that's the pattern. And so that, I first saw it in the Patterson film, and then saw it in 3,000 or 4,000 sighting reports. I really was committed to Bigfoot from 93 to roughly 1998. That was the 5 years where I had lots and lots of money, I had a project, I was fully engaged. Then, 1997, I got hired by the Fish Passage Center to track salmon in the Columbia River, and I started working for the tribes as a wildlife conservationist. And I had a whole career as a wildlife conservationist and ended up working for 27 years for the tribes. Actually, since I still work for the tribes, it's not over. But the thing is that I spent a lot of time all over the Northwest building detectors. At first, I focused on salmon, and I would build antenna arrays in streams and remote mountain headwaters of streams because I was trying to measure the survival of salmon from the point of birth to the sea and back from the sea back up to the spawning beds. And I was going through this. I was just part of a team. There were many, many of us. There were 10 people on my primary team, and we measured survival of the salmon. There was a huge court case where Bush administration tried to put us out of our misery and failed. And we ended up winning 2 cases in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals about our calculations of salmon mortality, because that's what it was all about. We basically, it's a very complicated subject, but the basic thing I was measuring was whether or not transported salmon that transport on the barges or on trucks down the river have the same survival as salmon that are left in the river. And do they have the same homing instinct to come back to their spawning beds when they get out to the sea and spend a few years and come back? Over the years, the tribes, because they had a view that the 5 first foods are the most important foods that the Creator put there for them. Salmon are the second food. The first food's water. Salmon are the second. Deer and elk are the third. Bitter root, which is a type of root, is the fourth. And the fifth is huckleberries. So the tribes then wanted me to measure the population and survival of the 5 first foods. So I spread from fish to wildlife and fish in terms of measuring populations, estimating what the populations were, estimating what the survival was year in, year out, all across the Northwest, because the area I dealt with was the area encompassed by the Warm Springs, Yakima, Nez Perce, and Umatilla tribes. Those 4 tribes were mine. So that's a big piece of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. And, of course, based on the 1855 treaty, the original treaty boundaries are much larger than today's reservations. In court decisions that have happened in the last 50 years, the courts have decided that the original treaty boundaries is where the tribes have wildlife management rights. And so they're in charge, they're co-managers of all the fish and wildlife within the boundaries of the original reservations in the treaties, which, if you look at them today, they're the size of Georgia, roughly 2.5 million acres. And it covers most of eastern Washington, eastern Oregon, and most of Idaho. So it's a large area, and I would build wildlife detectors and mark animals, and then using different scientific methods estimate population based on the resighting of marked animals. It's a thing called Patterson. It's a method. Anyhow, so I worked for the tribes for a very long time doing this, and after 10 years, they gave me my own project. So I had my own project called the Intertribal Monitoring Data Project, because I would monitor these populations and produce data and then funnel the data to the eggheads who needed to use it to analyze things. So I was like a data middleman for wildlife monitoring data. All the tribes had seen my movies on TV, so everybody knew that I was into Bigfoot. And all the elders would kid me about it all the time, and they would make fun of me. And I'll tell you one story. I had an idea that I would use a drone to count the fish in the fishing nets so that I could calculate the main stem Indian tribal harvest in Zone 6. And I would use a drone instead of a plane, because what we do now is a human being in a plane flies up and down the river and counts how many nets are out there, and then we make an estimate of how many fish are in the nets. So I was trying to do it via drone. And I had to get permission from what I call the chiefs of the river, which were the 3 Indians that, in my view, basically run the Indian part of the river. And I went to them and I set up a meeting, and I went to them and I pitched my idea of, hey, how about I use a drone to do this? And they agreed, but of course they said to me, one in particular said to me, well, Henry, that's a fine idea, but don't look for Sasquatch with the drone. So I was always getting joked with by the Indians about my obsession with they all knew I was obsessed with Sasquatch, and it didn't really put them off. They thought it was quite amusing that I, a white guy, would be so obsessed with Sasquatch. So they would tell me stories over the years, and over a very long time, as I earned the trust of the tribes by basically dedicating my life to helping them for 30 years, more and more stories would come my way, more and more information, more and more stories about where Sasquatch were found on the res, and where they like to hang out, and what they like to do, and what their nature was. And of course, just like everywhere else, many conflicting stories. And one Indian would passionately describe one crazy point of view, and another Indian would describe another one. It was very interesting, but I kept sorting through everything as I learned more and more, and I would meet more and more Indians that really didn't deal with the white outsiders at all. After I became sort of a trusted mascot of the tribe, I got a lot of information just from them about what they are and what they want and where they live. The big questions, because no one knows where Sasquatch lives, right? That's one of the big questions. I kept working for the tribes, but I left the natural resources world about 3 years ago, and I went back to pure IT, where I'm now working for 11 tribes, but I'm doing just IT work now. And some of the IT work I do is, I don't know if you know what WIC is. women, infant, and children. It's a government program, and so I do quality assurance on WIC systems for the tribes to make sure when someone implements a WIC system, it's compliant with all the regulations and laws and requirements that it needs to fulfill. And so I'm just finishing up one of those for 10 tribes. And I'm not allowed to talk about which tribes those are publicly at this time because of the current administration. So I can't really tell anybody what I'm really doing. But I'm working for a lot of Indians, that's for sure. And yeah, now I'm back in pure IT again, and I'll probably get more involved in natural resources management once again because I'm kind of an expert at it. One of the great mysteries for me with Bigfoot is why they're friendly to some people and other people never know they exist. Why do they show themselves to some people? Why do they not show themselves to others? I could never figure out what the pattern was. And I always tried to figure out what the pattern was and why some people were favored. And then I met people that were actually friends with Bigfoot, that they actually had ongoing relationships that were, I would describe as friendships. And a lot of these were Indian elders, and they don't talk about it. And it's just not something that is discussed, especially with outsiders. There's two kinds of Sasquatches, according to a couple of Indian elders I've spoken with. One is called the Xinu, and they're very friendly and filled with love towards humans. And the other is called Tepcon, and they are not. I do not know what their intent is, but I've just been warned that they don't care for humans and really have no use for us. I have surprisingly found out that a guy named Matthew Johnston in Southern Oregon, who I think I met for 2 minutes once at a Bigfoot gathering, says that they're called the Xanu, and that they're called the Xanu and the Tracon, which really sounds similar to the two words I was taught. And I said, wow, I didn't expect anybody outside of Indian elders to know this kind of stuff at all, And so now I'd like to talk to Matthew Johnston one day to see what he knows, because I'm like, gee, guy might actually know something. But I didn't think that based on what I had seen online. I was like, boy, this guy has no clue. So that's one thing I learned from them is the Xinu and the Tepcon are the two types. Now, in my life, I have only met big feet that are kind. So I believe I have only met Xinu. And that's all I've interacted with. I've never had an unpleasant experience in any way. Every experience I've had with them they've been very kind to me. And of course, I respect people that say, they're scary and monstrous and, they threaten to rip people apart. I mean, I hear all that stuff, but it doesn't jibe with my experience. Once I was driving in my van with my girlfriend, and we were looking for Bigfoot way up in the mountains in the Cascades. Suddenly, from between us, somebody went psst in my ear and did the same thing in her ear and was somehow between us in the front seat of the van. And so we both looked at each other and said, "What?" Like the other one had just said it. And since we said it absolutely simultaneously, we realized in the same moment that neither of us had done it. We had both been like joked with, would be the best term I could think of. Somebody was joking with us and playing with us and was invisible between us and went psst in both our ears. And we both just thought this thing. That was, I call that a Sasquatch experience. That's really just so out there. Who knows what it was? There are other times where I have stood in the woods with a Sasquatch right next to me, invisible. And I could sense it in so many ways, and it would touch me on my opposite shoulder, just like the game kids play on the 6th grade playground, where they come up to you behind you and they touch you on the shoulder to get you to turn that way and touch you on that to get you to turn that way. And the Sasquatch was playing that game with me, but it was invisible, and it was standing next to me, touching me on the left and right shoulder, and also joking with me again, just playing with me like I was a toy. Went to a rock quarry one day with a friend, and the rock quarry had a pile of gravel around the edge, and like a circular big pile of gravel with a hole in the middle. And I stood in the middle, and there was something walking on top of the gravel piles, knocking rocks down, walking around me. And as it walked around me, I would see the rocks actually falling down the slope into the thing, but I never saw anything. But I could hear the footsteps, and I could hear it walking, and I could see the rocks moving, but there was nothing to see. So I regarded that as a Sasquatch encounter, although nothing was visible. Another time I went camping at a place called Scout Lake, which is one of my more favorite places to go to have Sasquatch encounters. And a Sasquatch floated by me in the lake, and I first thought it was a beaver, but then I realized it was a Sasquatch doing a backstroke, and he just swam by me without saying anything. He just... Later that night, as I was trying to get into the tent that I had set up, bushes just outside the tent started shaking really intensely, like just really like somebody was really shaking them really, really, really hard. Once again, I didn't see anything. But I said, well, Sasquatch is around, because that's just one of those weird things. Then I heard what sounded like 100 crows cawing and coming, like a huge flock of crows coming to land. But there were no crows. And I said, that's weird. I call that a Sasquatch experience also. What my opinion is about Sasquatch, one of my many opinions, is that they can imitate other animals very, very well. They seem to they can do a great imitation of all the different animals. But the volume's wrong when they do it. It's just way too loud. So when I heard the 100 crows, it sounded like 100 really, really big crows. And then there was nothing. There was just no crows at all. It was like a complete imaginary thing. But it's not imaginary. That's the thing, that's a Sasquatch encounter in my book. A lot of people would not classify that as a Sasquatch encounter, but to me, there's no mistaking it. That is definitely them, and they're letting you know they're there, which is what they do. They tend to let you know they're around when they're around. I met a Sasquatch once, and he said, "Find the gold." And I went, "What? Find the gold?" And then he said, "Eyes in the wood." And I said, "Eyes in the wood? What does that mean?" Like, I don't know. And he said these things to me telepathically in English. As clear as day, I'm looking at the Sasquatch, and I get a overwhelming English word in my head, these phrases. And I'm like, oh my God, what, you're talking English. Didn't know that. There's a lot of times I've been in the mountains, and I'll be building an antenna array in a very, very remote place in like the Rockies in Idaho, and I'll hear a scream, or I'll hear a weird sound nearby, and almost always assume that it's Sasquatch watching me build this wildlife detector and expressing approval, because I think part of why I've been very lucky with my number of sightings and encounters is because I basically have been doing good as far as the creatures and the planet goes. I've been dedicating my life to being a conservationist. And I think Sasquatch gets a vibe off you or something. They're more, I don't know. They seem to be very, they let me know they're there a lot, is what I'm trying to say. But it's always a subtle thing like that. It's not always just a, hey, look at the big Sasquatch standing there. It's more like they're talking to me, or the kind of things that make everyone think you're completely insane. The tribal police force I worked alongside is the Columbia River Intertribal Fisheries Enforcement Group, which is an intertribal police force to enforce Indian fishing laws on Indians and to keep white people away from Indian fishing grounds, etc., etc. We would take videos of Sasquatch swimming across the Columbia River and then never share them with anybody outside our tribe. And we did that on 3 occasions I know of. I saw 3 different videos that my officer colleagues had filmed, and we would never show them publicly. But Australian crawl was one where it's definitely the Australian crawl with the occasional head thing. And I was like, okay, Sasquatch can do backstroke and Australian crawl. Within Indian country, there's a lot of films and photos that are taken that are never shared outside of Indian country, are seldom shared within Indian country, which I explained to Jill earlier. The what you probably don't know about the organization of tribes is that there's no separation between church and state. And there's different churches on the reservations. For example, in the Yakima, there's the Shaker Church, the Seven Drum Church, and the Longhouses. And the Longhouses and these different churches have groups of families that are parts of them. So one group of families is in this Longhouse, one group of families is in that Shaker Church. And they're competitive, and they don't share stories about Bigfoot. Bigfoot stories are owned by the Longhouse that has them, and they do not share with other members of their tribe that are in another Longhouse or in another church. And so it's all balkanized within the tribe as far as Bigfoot stories go, because they're considered property that a Longhouse owns. It's like a copyright out here in the white world. You can't use that story because they own it, and they don't tell it to anybody else. So in a strange, ironic twist of fate, an outside white person like me, in some cases, has more access to those stories because I am not a threat. I am not seen as a threat and not seen as something that you have to compete with. I'm an outsider and I'm just such a loser because I'm a white guy that I'm just no threat at all to any of this. That is part of the background that most people don't understand about how the tribes are actually organized. At my farm in Deer Island, one day, my wife was vacuuming the floor and looked out the kitchen window, and there were 2 15-foot tall big feet standing outside the kitchen window. And her reaction was, I didn't realize they were so big, because these were really big ones. One of the things they can do is control other animals and control you. They could walk you off a cliff if they wanted to. If you were a threat, they could actually take control of your autonomous nervous system and just march you right off a fucking cliff. And so don't stress them out. But yes, oh, hi, kitty. Yes, uh-huh. Yeah, well, yeah, so actually, one of the strange encounters I had was with cats, where I was in a cabin in the woods, and there were 9 cats in the cabin, and suddenly they all got in a train, nose to tail, and they walked around the perimeter of the room and out the door. And I said to myself, that's so weird. Sasquatch must have done it because it was just too weird. And of course, I never have proof of these things, but, you know, I always wonder. I always wonder if there's a hidden hand of Sasquatch behind certain things. You know, I've seen him in the woods. I've seen him in water. I've seen them a lot. That, like the films I was telling you about that the Indians have taken, where we had like 3 good videos of them swimming across the Columbia. They're found in the water a lot. One of my keys to looking for them is to find small lakes in the mountain, much like Skookum Lake, my first lake, and to observe that small area, that small lake in the mountain, because I've, over the years, decided that small lakes high in elevation are like doorways for them. For wherever they come from or go to, the lakes are the doors. And so they're often found in water, and I've seen a lot of them in water, in part because I go to mountain lakes looking for them, and in part because they're there where I find them. So, you know, I took my very first experience and ran with it and just kept looking at Skookum places and going to Skookum places and spending late nights at high mountain elevation lakes for like the next 30 years. So I just did what I did the first day over and over and over and over again. As a biologist, biological scientist, how do I explain Sasquatch? Well, get ready, because here we go. The biology is divided into 2 large schools. Really, one of the schools got killed off in the 1930s, the school of vitalism. And the school that we're in now is mechanism, and reductionism. That characterizes mainstream biology today. What that means is that, based on René Descartes and his theories that the world was a great machine and that all processes and everything occurring in the world in living beings could be traced down to purely chemical and physical processes that were occurring. In other words, everything is mechanical. There is no God. There is no spirit. There is just machines, and every animal is a machine. DNA somehow produces the machine. It's fiendishly complex how you get from one to the other, but somehow you do. And this view of what a living being is dominant now. But back in the 1930s, there was another school of thought, which was vitalism, that there was a force, Luke Skywalker, that the force actually was part of a living being, that you could not explain what it meant to be alive without a spirit infusing that inanimate matter. So there was some spirit that was fused together with the inanimate machine that became the living being that we know. This view fell out of favor a long time ago. Vitalism hasn't gotten any funding from anybody, really, since the 1930s. It was discredited. However, when you really study Sasquatch, it leads you to once again embrace vitalism, because you start to understand that not everything you experience with Sasquatch can actually be explained in mechanistic terms. And you start to see that mechanism does not fit the experiences you actually have. Of course, people will think, oh, yes, it does. You just have to, go through some convoluted hand waving. But My finding was no, it doesn't. And it can't explain Sasquatch turning invisible, standing next to you. It can't explain Sasquatch telepathically talking to you. It can't explain Sasquatch taking control of your body and marching you around. It can't explain any of those phenomenon. Another phenomenon I've seen with Sasquatch is I've seen Sasquatch move through really thick woods without disturbing a branch. The first encounter that started getting me really off the mainstream track was back in about 1995. I had a dream in 1995 with the 1-800-Bigfoot number that we had created, that one day we would get a sighting report within a couple hours, within 24 hours of it happening. That was the goal. At that time, 1995, every sighting report we ever got was from 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 10 years ago. Nothing ever current. And so our big dream was, one day we're going to get a sighting report within 24 hours of the sighting. And that was our big goal. And so one day, I'm sitting there on a Sunday afternoon answering the phone, and we get a call. I start getting calls from the Dalles. Different people calling back to back, saying they saw 7 Sasquatch in this valley, walking down this valley just half an hour away from Hood River where the office was. And I said, wow, alert, alert. And I alerted everybody. Peter Byrne, Todd Deary, all these people raced out. We got all our gear. It was winter. It was January, so there was snow on the ground about 2 feet. And we got to this valley, and there was a group of people on the one side of the valley, another group of people on the other side of the valley, and a group of people in the middle. And they were all just recreational. They all had cross-country skis. They were all just messing around. And we interviewed each group of people separately, and each group of people agreed 7 Sasquatch walked down the valley and out the box end of the canyon and out of sight. They went over the ridge, dropped out of sight. Well, we had never had, and so there were about 20 witnesses that all said the same thing. We saw 7 Sasquatch walk down the thing. And we're thinking, this is fantastic, because there's 2 feet of snow on the ground. So we look for tracks. There are none. There are no tracks at all. We actually have Peter Byrne, who's a tracker. So we find rabbit tracks. We find mouse tracks. We ourselves leave tracks. We find coyote tracks. We find every kind of track in the world, but we don't find any Sasquatch tracks, and we certainly don't find 7 sets of footprints. And so at the end of the day, we find nothing, and everybody else, Peter Byrne and Todd and the other people on the Bigfoot Research Project, are all like, they were mistaken. It's a hoax. It's a hoax, And I was like, the one person in the whole thing was me that said, no, it's not a hoax. It's something really weird we don't understand. Somehow they can walk through snow without leaving tracks. And I took that tack on things. Everybody else took that was bullshit tack. And I took no, there's something else going on here. These 20 people had no agenda. They did not want to, they didn't see millions or game show fame or anything. It's like they just were telling me what they saw, and there's no tracks. How could that be? That looks like magic. But I also kind of said, no, I don't understand the science behind what I'm seeing, because there must be a logical explanation for 7 big feet walking through 2 feet of snow and leaving no tracks. It can't be paranormal. It can't be like, woo, woo, wow, it's magic. No, there had to be something I didn't understand about how that worked. That had to work somehow, and that was clear to me, that there had to be a logical explanation for it. I didn't know what it was, but it started me thinking about what it could be. And that's part of science also, is to imagine mechanisms that explain what you're experiencing and what you're observing, and then to do the experimental design and test it, and then figure out what is testable and what isn't testable, and what you can learn and what you can't learn, and et cetera, et cetera. That's how science moves forward. The first step of science moving forward is somebody imagining a new mechanism and then trying to prove that it's real. So I didn't see what I was doing as anti-science at all. I kind of said, hey, I'm trying to move the ball down the field here. So nevertheless, an interesting thing that developed was I learned that there were footprints, but I couldn't see them, because what was the residue that was left behind was footprints that were colder than the surrounding snow, but did not disturb a molecule of snow. And so the snow molecules were not disturbed in any way, but they were chilled exactly where the big feet stepped. And I used what was called a dual frequency resonant infrared viewer to determine this, which is a piece of equipment that doesn't really exist in the world at this time. But you can make one with two different active infrared cameras that are slightly different frequencies from each other. And so, since cheap infrared cameras often they're not the best, they don't have the best frequency control in their manufacturing, and they don't actually send things out at the same exact wavelength. Just buying any two cheap infrared viewers, active infrared, and pointing them at something will show you more information about that thing you're looking at. In particular, it'll show you spots in the snow that are colder than the surrounding snow, which normal infrared does not show you because it doesn't cover that range. And that's what I saw in these, not in those footprints, but in other footprints that happened on another occasion when I ran into the same thing again, where a Bigfoot had exited the scene through the snow, leaving no footprints. It was many years later, and I had such a thing and looked, and that's when I determined that I could track them by seeing. I couldn't explain it. I cannot tell you why their footprints are colder than the snow that surrounds them, but I could track them. And so I was like, well, that's interesting. That's an interesting thing. Now that little bit of information right there, I've never told anyone, because for a long time, I didn't want to let anybody know how to track Bigfoot. But now I realize their powers are so much beyond ours, it's not a threat. It's no threat to them. But I learned that one day in 1995, I started to go, what's going on? Because these things clearly can walk through snow without leaving footprints, and that makes them not a normal animal. They are not normal. So what is a dimension? That's one of the big questions that everyone asks. Like, what is a dimension? This is a dimension, but what is it? So what I think separates the dimensions is the frequency of awareness. I think everyone's awareness has a specific frequency, but I have to back up, because one of the things I think about us, humans, living beings, continuing with that vitalism versus mechanism theme, is that we are antennas and we receive an awareness transmission that is our awareness. Our thought and our consciousness and our awareness is actually from the outside of our minds. It's actually located outside, and it's transmitted to an antenna our brain is an antenna. And so we think it's coming from inside, but it's coming from outside. And there is but one giant consciousness moving through all living beings, which is kind of an Eastern thing if you want to get Buddhist and Hindu. But the great Brahmas, the Brahmins, actually thought much the same thing. And you find that there are indigenous cultures that understand, in their view, that consciousness comes from outside and we receive it. It is not something that we generate from inside. This consciousness, our awareness, our eyes, what I think our eyes, how they work, is much like the camera you're using to film me right now. There's a frame rate. Our eyes have a frame rate. This camera is taking still photos at a frame rate and assembling them into a smooth motion picture. Our eyes do the same exact thing. They basically, at a much faster rate, they take snapshots of everything, and our subconscious minds stitch them together into this analog, smooth experience that we're living in right now. So we see this beautiful reality and movie, and we don't see the individual pictures that our eyes are splicing together to make this thing for us. Our subconscious takes care of this shit for us. Our conscious minds do not have access to the true power of our subconscious minds. And our subconscious minds are doing this sort of mechanism all the time in the background, enabling us to actually walk around here and think we're living beings walking on Earth. I think that this global consciousness has a specific frequency, and that every frequency, every living being here with us in this place has that exact same frequency of consciousness. We're all phase locked. Where this gets into quantum mechanics is, I think that this consciousness wave blinks on and off. Our awareness takes the pictures, takes the snapshots, and in between the snapshots, it may go somewhere else. Who knows? But our awareness is turning on and off at a frame rate very, very quickly. And so is that cat's. And actually the cat's matches ours exactly. All these things match us exactly. All living beings here with us vibrate at the exact same speed. And our eyes vibrate at the exact same speed. Sasquatch and some other beings that live here can vary the speed of their awareness. They can go faster or they can go slower. When they do that, they're in a different world, because this entire world is alive and is vibrating at this speed. What you think is an inanimate object like gravel is actually also alive and is vibrating, and it is aware. There is consciousness at every level in this world. The Sasquatch has the ability, they have conscious control over the true power of their subconscious mind. So they can actually change their speed and move to different worlds, because if you change the speed of your awareness vibrating, you go to another dimension. That's what I'm trying to say, is this is what different dimensions are. Different dimensions are the speed that your awareness is vibrating on. And if it vibrates at a different speed, you're in another dimension with everything else vibrating at that different speed. And it's awareness and thought and consciousness that's actually vibrating. So what this has to do with quantum, I'm like, well, it's sort of next door to quantum. I'm trying to describe the connection between consciousness and matter, which science as we know it today does not know. This is a black hole place for science as we know it today. And so this is an area that I really want to learn more about. But all my different experiences with Sasquatch have reinforced that they can change their vibrational state just a bit, which is how I think they walk through the snow without leaving a mark. Which is how when I've seen one walk through the forest without disturbing a branch, I realized that they were able to change their molecular density and be like a ghost, a visible ghost, but they can just walk through solid matter, and they can also make themselves really, really heavy and push over a huge tree. So they can change the density of their matter, and they can change the frequency of their consciousness. And I think that's how they change the density of their matter, is I think they actually alter their consciousness's frequency, and that is how they do a lot of different things. Here, the only evidence we really have that this is the case in the universe around us is electronic voice phenomenon from ghosts, which is when you're talking to dead people using a radio and you get the electronic voice phenomenon, you have to slow it down because it's twice as fast as normal speech, which I take as suggesting that what I'm talking about is a correct interpretation, that dead people are vibrating at a different awareness frequency than we are. And nothing ever dies. It just goes faster or slower. That's what happens when we die. We don't die. We just go faster or slower and are therefore in a different reality surrounding us with everything else that's moving at that speed. So I don't think that's quantum mechanics. But it doesn't really go against quantum mechanics either. You know, it's my theory about how it works. And I've found that, of course, Erwin Schrödinger, and Nikola Tesla also explored these ideas. And so it is not something I thought of. It is something that others have thought of in history but never got popularized. And then when I go back to indigenous people, for example, the Vancouver Island, the Kwakwaka'wakw, who used to be called the Kwakiutl, that tribe has a lot of Sasquatch contact. They have a secret society called the Hamatsa, which is a hereditary clan where it's the wild man society in the tribe. If you're a member of the Hamatsa, you can put a Zanukwa, which is their word for Sasquatch, at the bottom of your totem pole, because totem poles are read upside down. The thing closest to the ground is the most important totem in the totem pole, and it goes up to the top where the least important is. So you're only allowed to put Zanukwa on the bottom of your totem pole in a Kwakiutl village if you are a member of the Hamatsa. The current clan leader is a guy named Thomas Seward. He inherited chieftainship of the Hamatsa. Surprisingly, when I talk to him, I guess he doesn't really want to talk to Mr. Whitey, but he's kind of an acquaintance and a friend now. And he doesn't seem to have much real knowledge about Bigfoot, to me. That may be just because he didn't tell me. But I know he knows something, and I guess I'm trying to say I made such a big deal about the Hamatsa, knowing all about Bigfoot, and then when I finally met the chief of the Hamatsa, they didn't know all about Bigfoot, and I was like, shit. What I think forms a dimension is entrainment, in that this awareness, this thing behind your eyes, your consciousness, it's blinking on and off, on and off, on and off, which is very much like quantum mechanics. Things exist, don't exist, exist, don't exist. That's where I think there's definitely a connection. the quantum, everything is virtual particles going backwards in time and moving forward and whatever. What seems to have occurred is that there's a thing called entrainment in physics, where if you have a bunch of metronomes on a table, they will all sync up after time and be perfectly going together. In the beginning, you can have them all over the map, starting going this way and that, but by the end, they'll all be flapping together. This is entrainment. This happens with orbital things too. All of our planets in our solar system are kind of entrained right now. I think that entrainment occurs with consciousness until every one of us, every living being, is blinking on and off at the exact same time, and that's what actually forms this dimension. So this dimension is actually formed by our consciousnesses getting in phase with each other until they're perfectly in phase, and then we have a dimension. That's whatever. That's a crazy thought.
Yeah, but it makes sense. A lot of it makes sense to me.
I'm trying to ask the questions that can help science lead to a new place. Because my overall opinion about being a real biologist and studying Sasquatch is that science as we know it today cannot understand what it's seeing with Sasquatch. It just doesn't have enough breadth and data and information to actually understand what they're seeing, and so it's inadequate. Science as we know it today is inadequate to understand Sasquatch, and we must up our game quite a bit if we're going to have any hope of starting to understand how Sasquatch operates and how they work. I'm an outsider with the tribes, and yet I have really studied a lot of Indian culture because I'm fascinated by Indian culture. Interesting thing about the Xingu is that a lot of tribes here, plateau tribes as I call them because they live on the plateau, most of them, here in the Pacific Northwest, have a tradition of a vision quest where young children are sent up to the mountains at night to meet their guardian animal, their guardian spirit, their spirit guide, whatever you want to call it. And this still happens now if to Indians that are raised on the res in the old ways. So kids are sent up to the mountains to meet their spirit animal, and who is their spirit animal but the Xingu? And so, in essence, many children, when they are sent on this vision quest, fasting up to spend the night in the mountains, meet Bigfoot when they're about 10, 12 years old. But it's not Bigfoot, it's maybe in the form of a moose or a deer or a frog. Big feet seem to be able to shapeshift into any animal they want. And it's the same bunch as we all later see in these big hairy giants walking around the woods. That's just another form of the Xingu who take many different forms, in my opinion. Of course, since that's seen as, magic and out of control, but I don't call it magic. I just say we don't have the science yet to understand that, but these things are shapeshifters without doubt, in my opinion. And I think a lot of Indian kids also know that because they meet them when they're kids. And they form lifetime relationships in some cases. Maybe in all cases, I don't know. The overall protective attitude of the Sasquatch towards Indian tribes is evident to me, in that I do see that whether or not people want to believe it, it's more of the Indians own this subject more than the rest of us. Their culture recognizes the reality of these other beings and indoctrinates their children to know that they are real. I had a friend who, when he was a child, Umatilla, one night a whole bunch of Sasquatch came running through his village, throwing rocks on the top of the roofs everywhere, stealing all the salmon in the racks, a lot like the stories you hear about salmon stealing the salmon, Sasquatch stealing the salmon. So this happened to a friend of mine who's right now a professor at Portland State, by the way. So this is not a stupid person. And he watched these things run through town and raise hell and throw rocks at everything and steal all the salmon, screaming and yelling, and then they took off. In the morning, he asked his parents what that was. And his parents said, that wasn't anything. There was nothing. What are you talking about? There wasn't anything. And this is how all Indians, at least here in the Northwest, are basically raised. You are raised that it is taboo to talk about Sasquatch. You don't mention it. And when they do something like that and come to your village and steal all your salmon, you don't talk about it. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. And that's the culture that they are raised in, which is really not the white culture. There are true cultural differences between Indians raised on the res and us. Really, and this is one of them. A really profound one is that's how your parents raise you, to not mention it if you ever encounter them. The other thing is there's all kinds of rules for every tribe is different. You can't generalize about Indians at all, really. What you experience on your vision quest as a child, you are also not allowed to talk about. It is taboo. But different tribes have special rules where if you're in battle and your life is threatened, at that time you can actually tell somebody what you saw on your vision quest, just during that special circumstance. And different tribes have different special circumstances where it's allowable to actually say what happened, what you saw, but generally you're not allowed to talk about it. And like I said, there's no separation, church and state, so you don't talk about it. That is not what I think anybody else in the Bigfoot world is thinking about, is that the spirits that Indians encounter on their vision quests are Bigfoot, basically. Or they're the nice big feet, whatever you call big feet. I think big feet are basically another order of life that is a ball of energy. And that ball of energy can take any form, and we are dealing with a life form that is pure energy. That's actually what we're dealing with, and we can't really wrap our heads around it. There's the flesh and blood guys and the paranormal guys and all that, but I think in the end, what I'm the guy I am is I'm the ball of energy guy. I think that we're all balls of energy, you and me, and we are balls of energy with like these little shells of bodies that are, that surround our balls of energy. I think in the case of Bigfoot, they're balls of energy that can put different shells around their balls of energy, but basically they can also just exist purely as energy. I've seen evidence of that in my experiences where I've seen, huge electrical disturbances. I had the strange electrostatic experience I told you my very first day. Because I had that weird experience my first day, I went down a very different route than most people, because I just immediately started going force fields, invisibility, and everybody else is like, well, there's a big creature in the woods, and I'm like, no, it's weird. It's totally weird. I'm a musician. I'm a drummer. And I've made 20 records, and I've been signed and dropped from 4 indie record deals at this point. I'm an old retired drummer now. It was really interesting to me to understand if there was some rhythm or something that they liked, like what was their groove, because I'm a drummer, everything has a groove. What's their groove? And I had this communication with Bigfoot which is really out of this world. Where I was just sitting in my living room, and Bigfoot said to me telepathically, "All good bands play bolero." And I sat there going, is that me? Is that my imagination? Like, what was that? And then after contemplating it for quite a while, I said, God, that was Bigfoot telling me that all good bands play bolero. Bolero is a piece by Ravel back in the 1920s, and it's actually, the time signature is 18, and it's phrased in 3 blocks of 6. And Jeff Beck actually does a version of Bolero on his latest record. Jeff Beck is famous for doing different versions of Bolero. So I just happened to say, okay, after I trying to figure out what this meant, I bought a bootleg Jeff Beck record from Germany. That was his latest thing. And I put it on, and the very first track was Bolero. And I went, wow, that's really amazing. This clearly was a Sasquatch message for me, but what does it mean? It's not the first time that I have looked into the world to try to figure out the grooves of different things. One of the things about 6 is that the master musicians of Jujuka in Africa play a song that's in 5 and 6 that summons the great god Pan, according to their theory. And I said, oh, man, so maybe we're talking summoning Pan here, But over time, I decided that it was the 6, which is often a female number, let us say a female rhythm. Females are more 6, males are more 5, in my weird drum head. And so I was like, okay, 6. And then Tobe, came up with some recordings of beats that he obtained, and they were in 6. And I was like, yes, suspicions confirmed. I thought they had a thing for 6, and apparently they do. This started because long time ago, when I was first starting in 1993, there was a guitarist that just took his acoustic folk guitar out in the woods, and he would play his guitar for Sasquatch. And he'd go up there and he'd play actually near Skookum Lake. And then when he would finish and go back to his car, there were all kinds of footprints all around his car, and the Sasquatch had been dancing to his music. And so I was like, wow, they dance to music. They like music, and they like to dance. I'm like, yeah, great, man. I can help out with that. So that's really the bit about 6 that I think, yes, Tobe has like 2 or 3 recordings of knocking sounds or whatever that definitely are a 6 phrase. Sasquatch has completely changed my life, because originally when I tried to figure out, the question I asked was, what is their role in life? What are they doing here? How do they fit into nature? What's their role in nature? Like, I figured they're part of nature like the rest of us. So where do they fit in? And I decided they were conservationists. Their job was to take care of all the wild creatures in the forest, which is also something I found confirmed in certain old Indian stories, which basically said the same thing. But through my interactions with them, and I had a couple of interactions, one that I told you about, where the crickets all knew they were there and shut up when I had the encounter in the van, and the crickets stopping and then starting again told me, well, the crickets know they're here. Another time I saw a Sasquatch standing there, and little red squirrels were running over its feet, just like playing like it was a tree, and up and down its calves and all over its feet. And I was like, wow, the squirrels aren't scared at all. Like they're like playing with it like it's a jungle gym. And I said, gee, if the other animals aren't afraid of it, why are we afraid of it? Because clearly they're not. So I became a wildlife conservationist largely because of Sasquatch. And largely because of Sasquatch, I explored my connection, my tribal heritage, because I'm not enough Indian to be an Indian, but I do have 4 tribes in me. So it's just I don't have enough of any one tribe to be an enrolled member in anything. And basically, I was raised white, and I'm a white guy, and I was born in Paris, France, so, I'm white as hell. So because of Sasquatch, I became a wildlife conservationist and a fisheries scientist and worked for the tribes for near 30 years. And basically, I emulated the Sasquatch. I said, if their job is to take care of all the living creatures, I'll do the same. I'll take care of all the living creatures in a small way. I don't have the abilities they have, but in a small way, I can help take care of the creatures. Some of the big takeaways that I get from Sasquatch are, what is this place we live? Science as we know it today can tell us all about matter and can tell us about energy, but it really can't tell us what this place is that we live. Yeah, we know it's a spinning dirt ball, third stone from the sun. We know all that, but we don't really know. And we don't know the connection between consciousness and 3D reality. And science, as we know it today, doesn't know it. Science does not know where consciousness comes from still. These are really open-ended questions right now. Science may feel they're on the verge of determining the origin of consciousness, but I don't think they are. They don't have it yet. No one knows where it comes from. And all of these things are things I learned from Sasquatch, that consciousness comes from the outside. It's not a mechanical process coming from the inside. And as I explained before, the difference between conscious and subconscious, and in our species, how we don't have conscious control of our subconscious mind, but they do in their species. That is these are all things that I've learned from them about the nature of our life. The fact that I've basically concluded that they're balls of energy also has shown me that we're balls of energy. And yes, we have these shells of flesh and blood, but it's convinced me that we are immortal. Studying Sasquatch has convinced me that all creatures are immortal. Nothing ever dies. It just goes faster or slower. We call it death, but it's not death. And so that's something I've learned from Sasquatch. I've learned a lot of profound things about this place we live and who we are and who I am from studying Sasquatch. Sasquatch has taught me a lot about what it means to be a human being, and has taught me about the connection between consciousness and reality, between the world of heat, light, and physics, and the immortal spirit. And I have learned quite a bit about how those things interrelate to each other and how they work from Sasquatch. Sasquatch has taught me that I am just a ball of energy as well inside a flesh meat sack. I'm a meat puppet. Sasquatch has taught me I'm a meat puppet, and that everything is immortal, and that we are immortal and we only go faster or slower when we die.